In recent years, the Christian church has gone rapture crazy. Now, thanks to books like The Late Great Planet Earth in the 1970s by Hal Lindsey, and most recently the Left Behind book series and film series by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins, the Christian church has gotten into the fervor believing that they are the generation where the rapture is going to happen, which will precede the 7-year tribulation and an antichrist running around until the destruction of the entire world. I can safely and thankfully say that you don't have to worry at all about it, because the rapture already happened. That's right, it already happened. Praise God for that. The reason why I say that is because if it didn't happen, then we'd be in a lot of trouble, because we'd be worshiping a false Messiah. And we might as well throw away our New Testaments if that's the case. You see, the language in the Gospels and the epistles and in the Revelation state that the rapture and the second coming of Christ had to happen within the generation that first heard Jesus. Now, this gives us a very small period of time in which we can work with, and for it to happen now would be a complete falsehood. It had to have happened, or else Christ was a liar and the apostles were liars and pulled off one of the greatest charlatan scams in history. Now, in 1887, a very important book by James Stuart Russell came out, and it was called the Parousia. And the entire book outlines the doctrine of the second coming of Christ from a biblical standpoint and gives all the proofs of its complete fulfillment. Now, the exciting part about this is that in the public domain, I don't have to worry about having somebody say, hey, you're breaking a copyright by sharing this. So I'm going to share a very important piece from his book here regarding the evidence of the rapture. And it says, what evidence, for example, may be reasonably required that the most seemingly incredible event predicted in Matthew 24:31 and in 1 Thessalonians 4:17, commonly denominated the rapture of the saints, actually took place? Now, keep in mind also, 1 Corinthians 15 gives us a very nice description of the rapture, but I move on with this. The principal, if not the only, portion that seems to come within the cognizance of human sense is the removal of a great multitude of the disciples of Christ from this earthly scene. We might expect, therefore, that there should be some trace in history of this sudden disappearance of so vast a body of believers. It surely must have made a blank in history, a failure, at the least, in the continuity of the records of Christianity. Admitting that the predictions do not require an absolute and universal removal of the whole body of the faithful, for it is manifest that there is a clear distinction made between the watchful and the unwatchful, the ready and the unready, and that as many might be shut out of the kingdom as those who went in. Yet the language of the prophecy certainly implies the sudden and simultaneous removal of a very great number of the faithful. Of course, this is the rapture. Is there then any vestige in history of such a blank? Most certainly there is, and just such an indication as we might expect. A silence which is expressive. Silence where a moment before all was life and activity. And we move on, because this is an important part. The silence. The ecclesiastical historian will tell you that the light suddenly fails him. The Christian church of Jerusalem, of which an apostle could say, "Thou seest, brother, how many myriads there are among the Jews which have believed," suddenly dwindles into two wretched sects of Ebionites and Nazarenes. Now, this is an important thing to notice, because these cults of Judaism that incorporated Christian thinking were all that existed after this point. The Parousia, the second coming of Christ. Where are the many myriads of St. James? Where are the 144,000 whom St. John saw with the seal of God on their foreheads and standing with the Lamb on Mount Zion? Did they perish in the siege of Jerusalem? Certainly not. For it is universally agreed that, forewarned by their divine master, they retired from the doomed city to a place of safety. Fortunately for us, Eusebius, who is the church historian who wrote the ecclesiastical history, lets us know that the Christians were given a divine revelation, which we also know as the book of Revelation, and also the epistles and the gospels that warned of the second coming, went and ran off to Pella. This is recorded by Eusebius. Pella is in modern Turkey, so they escaped the wrath of God before the destruction of Jerusalem. I continue. Yet they seem to disappear and leave no trace behind. Ask the ecclesiastical historian to put his finger on the spot where the records of early Christianity are most obscure, and he will unhesitatingly point to the period when the Acts of the Apostles end. Of this period, the learned Neander says that we have no information, nor can the total want of sources for this part of church history be at all surprising. And again, he speaks of the age immediately succeeding the apostolic, of which we have unfortunately so few authentic memorials. Heidekoper, a Dutch theologian, in his work entitled Christ's Descent to the Underworld, remarks that on leaving the apostolic age, we almost lose sight of the Christians in a historical chasm of 60 or 80 years. This is very, very important. The silence is absolutely deafening. Why were there no reports written after of this rapture? Well, as I've explained in some of my other videos, the book of Revelation was not written in the 90s under Domitian by John, because we've already been reported that John was murdered by the Jews in Jerusalem in around 64 AD. We also know from the language of the Revelation that the temple was still in existence. And the fact of the matter is that our good friend John was under Domitiano, another name for Nero. It appears that Irenaeus, through the only copy we have in Latin, has given us a very unfortunate chasm which we have to cross here, where was it Domitian in the 90s, or was it Nero Domitiano, who was the beast of Revelation, and at the time of the Revelation being written. But being that Revelation was written around 62 AD, and we know that most likely the final writing of the New Testament was by St. Peter in 2 Peter, which would have been around 64 AD, are there any Christian documents that let us know that the rapture happened around the same time as the second coming of Christ? Unfortunately, we don't have that, because a rapture would mean there were no Christians left behind, and the previously mentioned sects such as Ebionites and Nazarenes would lead to heresies, heretical writings, and what would later become Catholic legends and Gnostic writings. However, we do have an incredible answer for you. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, in 75 AD, wrote The Jewish War and published it. Now, keep in mind, the siege of Jerusalem was between 66 and 70 AD for 42 months, fulfilling the prophetic timeline of that period when Christ was supposed to be having his Parousia, his second coming. And 5 years later is pretty darned close to have an eyewitness account. Now, this is probably one of the most fascinating passages from his book, The Jewish War. And keep in mind, Josephus was not a Christian, and the language he uses in his Antiquities does not exactly present the greatest friendliness towards Christians either. But I continue right here. This is regarding the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which happened in 66 AD. On the 21st day of the month Artemisius, Artemisius, I don't want to get the pronunciation wrong, which is in Jair, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable, were it not related by those that saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For before sunsetting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding of cities. Moreover, at that feast, which we call Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the temple, as their custom was, to perform their sacred ministrations, they said that, in the first place, they felt a quaking and heard a great noise, and after that they heard a sound as of a great multitude saying, "Let us remove hence." Probably one of the most significant writings regarding the possibility of the rapture being named to the actual day. Now, is this the actual rapture, or did the rapture happen around the 70 AD mark? Unfortunately, some silence has to remain in history, but we do know one thing. The second coming of Christ did happen, which means the rapture happened. Now, it took a Jewish historian for us to hear this, but even better still, there's a backup to it. Now, I don't have the passage in front of me now, but it's very similar, and it comes from Cornelius Tacitus, the Annals of Imperial Rome, written only a short while after, probably within about a 40-year spread. The exact same incident by a pagan Roman historian. Now, you can decide from here whether I'm right on this or whether I'm wrong, but I know one thing. If the rapture didn't happen, Christ and the apostles lied to us. They lied to us about an upcoming rapture, and they lied to us about Christ's second coming. Fortunately for us, this did not happen. But instead, the reality of the rapture and the second coming of Christ is in fact reality. They did happen. And the best testament for it is Josephus's The Jewish War, published in 75 AD. Now, I would like to conclude with one last thing here. It's a final passage from Josephus, from the same area of his book. And this happened just before this incident. Feast of Unleavened Bread. When the people were coming great crowds to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, on the 8th day of the month Xanthicus, which is Nisan, and at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone round the altar and the holy house that it appeared to be bright daytime, which light lasted for half an hour. This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskillful, but was so interpreted by the sacred scribes as to portend those events that followed immediately upon it. At the same festival also a heifer, as she was led by the high priest to be sacrificed, brought forth a lamb in the midst of the temple. You want to hear about signs of a second coming of Christ, written by a Jew who was not a Christian. That's pretty gnarly beyond measure to any mind to be able to comprehend. But there's one thing I haven't added right there. Do you know what a heifer is? A heifer is a female virgin cow. A virgin cow in the middle of the Jerusalem temple gave birth to a lamb before the priests. Think about it.